Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I am here today with historians, Civil War historians, Rebecca Jo Plant and Frances Clarke. So today we'll be talking about their latest work, Of Age, Boy Soldiers, Parental Rights and Military Power in Civil War America, and we'll be talking about their research on underage enlistment during the Civil War. So if you guys could please just kind of give a brief synopsis about your book. Rebecca?
Well, I have to say it's a hard book to give a brief synopsis of, but it's a book that really takes as its starting point the fact that underage soldiers were a big problem during the American Civil War. They were a problem in regard to family members who were not prepared to have their teenage sons go off to war and leave them without the help that they provided on farms or in shops. They were a problem to courts because parents often turned to courts to seek their discharge, because this was a period of time in which you could use the writ of habeas corpus to get people who were fraudulently enlisted discharged from the military. And it was a big problem for government offices and political representatives who were really besieged by appeals from desperate parents who were trying to get their sons back. So just the fact that this was such an enormous problem and generated so much government correspondence is, I think, what Frances and I were initially sort of intrigued by, and we wanted to understand like what is going on here with, and it also generates legislation. Congress goes back and forth in terms of the laws that they pass in regard to age of enlistment. So I think that was our starting point, but then we go off in a number of different directions. So maybe Frances wants to expand on what I just said.
Yeah, so we started with the enormous problem, as Rebecca said, and then then we started thinking about questions like, when does the age of enlistment become an issue? So, what is when does the idea of youth in the military become a problem? How does people's thinking about that problem change over time? Why is the icon of the sweet little drummer boy, why is that icon so powerful in the Civil War? So what's the sort of culture around boy soldiers? How does the idea of the child soldier, which is so contested, today when people think of child soldiers, they think this is a terrible idea. And yet, in an earlier period, this is a, very, very sentimentalized topic. So, we were interested in that phenomenon. We've taken the book in, we've looked at that question from a number of different directions: the sort of legal, the political, the cultural, and the familial, the personal.
Thank you. That's great. So I have a few questions for you guys about your book. Sounds like a very interesting topic that you guys selected. So what drew you to research and publish a book about this topic of underage enlistment?
Well, I started doing research on a different topic in the National Archives, and one of the first things I noticed when I was doing this research, there's a huge volume of correspondence sent into the government during the Civil War. So, hundreds of thousands of letters from ordinary people. And, I was going through the first year or two of this correspondence, and I noticed that a really huge number of letters were from parents of underage enlistees. And, I spent a couple of years working on another project of putting those letters aside. And then finally, but letters in the National Archives are folded in three. So you can't just you don't know what's in them until you unfold them and read them. So I had to kind of read them to see what the people were asking the government for. And I was reading one after the other of these letters from parents requesting, you know, the government release their 12-year-old, their 10-year-old, their 19-year-old. And, you know, so the first question that I had was, why is this, you know, why didn't they just let the children out of the military? And I ended up taking, you know, taking these sources to Rebecca. When I go to the States, I'm in Sydney, Australia. So, you know, I go through San Diego, and Rebecca and I weren't working together at this time. I was, you know, working on this project on citizenship on my own. And I went through San Diego, and I had this, you know, bunch of letters from parents. And I said to Rebecca, you know, look at this stuff. The parents are not talking in a way that we imagined, or I imagined at the time, that parents should be talking about children at war. They weren't asking the kinds of things I thought they would be asking, and there was such a volume of them. So I showed these to Rebecca, and I, you know, Rebecca's an expert on 20th century war and family history, and you know, so I thought she's the perfect person to talk to about this. And she insisted that this was the project that we should be working on, you know, parental rights. So, you know, I blame her for everything that happened. that was about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And so, how does the research that you guys have done, how would that contribute to the general knowledge of, or the larger Civil War era?
Well, to the extent that people have written about underage soldiers, it's a topic that, you know, even to this day, as Frances suggests, is sort of shrouded in sentimentality, and it's, you know, a lot of the writing on underage soldiers is actually juvenile literature, children's books. It's a sort of way of drawing in young people's interest in American history. So there are tons of books about, you know, an underage soldier who heads off to war or joins the Navy. So there's not actually a lot. I mean, there's some people have written on, some scholars have written on underage soldiers, but it has not generated a book like ours. It's more like chapters of books or articles. So there was a kind of gap in the scholarship just in terms of the topic itself. And a little bit more broadly, because we actually start the book in 1812, because it was a serious issue in the War of 1812 as well, although at that point the debate was really focused on use age 18 to 21, 21 being the age of majority for young males. So just the fact that this had been a long-standing problem for the U.S. military, the notion that, you know, the age of majority, 21, was not the same as the age at which people expected young boys to bear arms. And part of the problem is that, you know, the United States has this dual military system where we have the regulars, and then we have also the militia. So, so people were generally fine with youth serving in the militia, but they were not okay with youth serving in the regular army, which required longer commitment. It required possibly going greater distances, and it required being under the control of strangers and subject to much harsher military discipline. So that story about how the military deals with underage use is not a story that really has been told within. I mean, it's a social history, but it's also a military history. It was an issue that plagued the War Department, you know, not just in the Civil War, but throughout the 19th century. So I think we contribute to the literature in that regard as well.
And I'd also add that, you know, one of the surprising things that we that we found initially, one of the reasons that we thought this is a book worth writing is because the legal cases around underage enlistment are the cases that transform that actually transform the legal understandings of the US military. So, it's a case of underage enlistment, or it's a series of cases of underage enlistment that, that allow courts to determine where the military, what its place is in the federal system. It's cases of underage service that transform the idea of what a military contract is. So, we're looking at underage enlistment as a sort of fulcrum around which the dual military system gets transformed, and also the idea of parental rights. What right does a parent have versus what right does the government have to come into the family and commandeer the labour of what was understood at the time as incredibly important labour of young men aged between 18 and 21. So.
And just to add to what Frances said, it's also, in regard to these very important legal cases, it's also true that it's a case of underage enlistment that essentially federalizes habeas corpus, which basically means that state courts lose the right to have any kind of control over the military in their local area, so that you can no longer, serve a writ to an officer and say, you're holding my son, and have that heard in a local or state court where you have some power and that is easy to access. Now this is taken out of that realm, and only federal courts can hear cases of detention that are where the detainer is a federal entity like the US military. So, that sounds kind of abstract, but it wasn't abstract to people at the time. I mean, it sounds like a very academic issue, but for people at the time, this meant, like, do you have an ability to, recover your son from a situation of detention that is not completely outside your control, and that could take months or years to gain success, if you ever are able to succeed. Many of the cases that we look at, parents spent years trying to recover their children, and they never did. And these were people who, should not have been, according to the regulations of the Army, they shouldn't have been enlisted in the first place. And yet, parents are not able to recover them. So what sounds maybe fairly arcane is actually on the ground, like really one of the best examples that we could find of how in the Civil War, these issues of power between the federal government, the military, and local communities and families, that, it's playing out right there.
Yes, absolutely. That sounds like absolutely fascinating. So it sounds like your research subject is pretty unique in itself, if it's only been largely written about in chapters of other books. So of course, that's definitely added to the historiographical discussion on underage enlistment. But is there anything else that your book contributes to that historiographical debate?
Well, I would add, it's funny that we didn't start with the number of underage soldiers, because in some ways that why don't they let them out? We ended up at the end of this long process of trying to figure that out. How did the government deal with underage enlistees, and why did they have such convoluted rules? We ended up coming to the conclusion that they couldn't let them out because there were so many of people who served underage. And this in itself, in the Civil War, the question of how old were the people who went to war, in some ways it doesn't matter if you're 17 and 9 months or 18. In some ways it doesn't matter, but it actually mattered a lot to people at the time, and it certainly mattered legally and politically. So, you know, we came to the conclusion through a long and complex process, which included counting the number of underage enlistees in particular regiments, that there were over 10% of soldiers in the Civil War were underage.
In the Union Army. And we would guess, we can't say it quite so definitively for the Confederate Army, but we think as well, yeah.
So, you know, that I think will perhaps be a surprise to people in Civil War history. The general assumption is that around 1 to 2% of Union soldiers served underage, and, you know, that it was a minor phenomenon, basically. And so we're saying, you know, it's a vast phenomenon, actually. A lot of political and, you know, legal resources are spent trying to deal with this issue. It generates a lot of heat. And, you know, it's sort of legally formative and, you know, but also it affected a lot of people, you know, hundreds of thousands of people we're talking about here, not a small number of, you know, people.
Absolutely.
And interestingly, the reason why, you know, people assume that it was 1 to 2% is because they've relied heavily on military records. But of course, boys who are trying to enlist lied. So it did require, as Frances suggests, a pretty painstaking process of, like, we studied one particular regiment, all of the 18-year-olds. We looked at, you know, comparing them to census records and found that, you know, half of them were lying. So that was pretty eye-opening to us to realize that, but also very validating, because it made sense then why we kept seeing, you know, in courts and in government offices that this issue keeps coming up. Well, it keeps coming up because there are just so many. The volume of underage enlistees is high. So it does, you know, like Frances says, it doesn't make a difference if you're 17 years and 9 months versus 18, but it does make a difference if you're saying, well, the average age of the U.S. Union soldier is between 23 and 24 versus, I mean, you know, presumably our findings, we actually haven't tried to calculate this. I'm not entirely sure how we would, but I actually think our findings have to push that forward as well, you know, that the average age of enlistment. And just in terms of your sort of composite image of what the Union Army looks like, the Union Army has a lot more boys in it. And they're not just drummer boys. That's the other important thing about our work, is that a lot of people tend to assume underage enlistees were musicians, were drummer boys or fifers, and the majority of them were not. They were regular soldiers.
It's absolutely fascinating. That statistic, you said 10%, right? Wow, that blows my mind. I had no idea. Oh, wow.
Hopefully the rest of the people in Civil War history will say the same.
Yeah. So it sounds like absolutely fascinating research. Was there any particular source that that struck your interest, really struck a chord and really shocked you, or anything super memorable like that?
Particular source.
Well, you know, some of the letters that Frances has been referring to, I mean, that really was our starting point. The letters from parents seeking the discharge of underage.
There's one, the one where the mother says, "He is my property. You know, I demand his return. He's my property." And I was like, "What? Property?" Now it just seems really, you know, it's just standard to see parents talking in this way. But, you know, I mean, my first book was on Victorian sentimentalism. So, you know, I was well familiar with the trope of the sort of the massive sentimentalization of motherhood and childhood that had taken place by this time, you know, well by this time. So seeing parents talking this way, and not just working class parents, you know, all parents, you know, from across the class spectrum. So, you know, that to me was really arresting. And that's I think the first source I took to Rebecca. And Rebecca was like, "Oh, this is, you know, this is significant." You know, we need to understand the kind of proprietary language, it's, you know, through which parents are understanding their children. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things we've really gone back and forth with, and you know, have really tried to sort out is, and we've gotten some help actually from Laura Edwards on this, the legal historian who, you know, points out that these are legal arguments that people are making when they say, you know, he's my property. They're basically pointing to common law. They're pointing to the fact that parents had property rights in children and children's labor, right? So on the one hand, they're making these arguments for very strategic reasons. They want their kids out, and they're using this language as a way of putting forward their legal claims. On the other hand, it becomes pretty clear, and you can see this sometimes even like when it's just letters. We have a few, not many, but letters between the kids and their parents, right? And it becomes clear that the parents do have a sense that that legal claim does translate, even in the mid-19th century when you've had the rise of these sentimental ideas, that there is some kind of bleed over from like a legal concept of, you know, property rights to like, how do I view this individual who I've raised and love? You know, that it's a kind of, I mean, one of the things that's most interesting about doing history is that you can historicize things that don't seem like they have a history, like love, like a, you know, parent-child bond. It has a history, right? And we see that in the documents that we look at, that that they're switching back and forth very fluidly between, you know, I need this youth to run my shop. He's mine, and I would die if I lost him, you know, like it would shatter my world. So both kinds of things are really operative, and they're not in conflict the way that from a modern standpoint, we would tend to assume they should be in conflict.
And actually thinking about, you know, the sources where you just feel really arrested and you realize this is a radically different situation. The other one, another one of my favorites is an ABC book. You know, I looked when I was at the American Antiquarian Society. They have an amazing collection of children's books, children's alphabet books. And I was looking at children's alphabet books from the Civil War, and there's an ABC book, and all of the pictures are so violent. I mean, this is for, you know, 4-year-olds. You know, they're pictures of bloody bodies on the battlefield. You know, B is for battle, with a bunch of wounded bloody bodies lying there. And when I looked at that, I thought, okay, that, you know, that is a radically different perception of
he is for traitor being and he's hung, you know.
David's being hung by a tree. You know, radically different. You're dealing there with a culture that understands childhood interiority, what happens in a child's mind when they look at a violent image in a very different way, you know, than our culture understands that. So, you know, we also have a chapter that looks at the way people in the mid-19th century use violent images and for kind of pedagogical ends, if you like.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. The children's book, that caught me by surprise, and I'm not even the one who saw it.
Yeah.
So, oh geez, it looks like we're running a little low on time. So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions probably. So the fact that you guys are in radically different time zones, Frances, you are in Sydney, Australia, and Rebecca, you are in California. Has that created any problems or issues, any major challenges with your research?
Not until COVID. I mean, you know, it's annoying because our school years don't connect. And so, you know, I'll go to Rebecca's and she'll be in the middle of a horrible, you know, or a challenging semester, shall we say, or she'll come here. So that, you know, it's lovely in a way. But we are, at the moment, Rebecca is in the corner of my screen all day, every day, because it's the first time since we started writing this book that we have time off at the same time. And, you know, so, and Rebecca tends to work late at night and I tend to work early in the morning. So actually it's kind of working out now in the final stages of
Although
this.
it's wreaked havoc with my sleep schedule, so.
But Abby, it's not ideal. It's not ideal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's not actually the first time. I mean, it was really critical that I went to Australia for a period at the beginning of when we were writing, not researching, but when we really sat down to write, I was in Australia. And that was really important. We had this very intensive period of several months that, you know, it's hard for me to imagine that we would have ever, how we could have launched this project without that period of face-to-face interaction. I moved my whole family there.
Yes.
I sat in an Australian school. It was
Yeah,
kind of.
well, we've had a couple of those. You know, it's an incredible privilege, you know, to be able to do that. You know, to have research leave, and you know, this is not a book that could have been written actually without the kind of funding provided by, you know, there's an Australian government grant that we've got, and the ACLS grant. I mean, that was what allowed us to work in the same space. And you know, we've had a few of those moments where we've been together and we've been writing at the same time in the same room, which is, you know, an amazing experience for me.
I bet COVID presented quite the surprise and the challenge, though, as far as connecting in person on your research, though.
Thank God for Zoom.
And thank God we were done with our research. You know, I feel so sorry for my graduate students who, you know, they want to be off at the archives, and it's.
Mm-hmm. Thank God for digital archives.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else that, any other topic or anything that I didn't really touch on that you guys wanted to add to the discussion? Or is there any remaining questions that your research has presented?
I think one of the things we're just trying to work out now, we're finishing the book now, and we're writing what is currently an epilogue on what happens to these guys and what happens to the general discussion around underage soldiers. It becomes a very hot topic in the late 19th century. There's all this jockeying around the question of who's the youngest, who was the youngest soldier, all these you know, newspaper-run competitions, and it just generates an enormous discussion. So we're still sort of puzzling over, you know, exactly what, you know, where this phenomenon ends up and how it ultimately influences the culture and politics as well. An enormous number of U.S. senators and representatives were underage soldiers in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's pretty interesting too, that clearly they're carrying these experiences forward with them in interesting ways. So that's our last puzzle. That's the thing we're sort of trying to figure out exactly nail down exactly what we want to say about that at the moment. But I think it will be something interesting. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like an utterly fascinating discussion and topic, and the epilogue as well sounds just so interesting. I'm gonna have to snag myself a copy when you guys publish your book. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to meet with you. Excuse me. Thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. I enjoyed talking to both of you about your research, and I'm excited to read the book for myself.
Thanks, Abby. You're the first person we've talked to actually in a public setting about the book, or one of the first people. So thank you for your interest.
It's an honor.
Yes, thank you. It's really an honor, and it's been fun.
Yeah, definitely.